Rebecca Billings currently serves as a Foreign Affairs Officer in the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. She joined the U.S. Department of State in 2003 and has worked with the Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, covering Southeast Europe, and working in the Executive Secretariat, assisting the Secretary of State with her overseas travels, including being assigned to assist with negotiations in Jerusalem during the Israel-Lebanon conflict in July 2006. As a side note, she will be speaking about her professional life and her work traveling with the Secretary of State at 3 o'clock here in this room, which I think will be a rare and interesting insight into the work of colleagues at the Department of State. We hear from a number of foreign service officers, but we don't get the opportunity to hear from many civil service officers, as Ms. Billings is, and I think there's an insight here that will be useful for those of you who are interested in careers internationally as well as careers in diplomacy. Her career path following graduation led her from Utah Valley to Chicago and on to Washington, D.C. Billings received both a BA and an MA in humanities with an emphasis in art history. So she's also a brilliant example of the importance of a broad liberal education and the many things and opportunities that can come to you with a broad education. I mentioned the 3 o'clock lecture here in this room and would encourage those of you who are seriously thinking about careers in international affairs and diplomacy or with the State Department or other federal government agencies to come back at 3 o'clock. I'd also like to mention that there is a planning process ongoing among some faculty, including some at the Kennedy Center, to organize a conference dealing with trafficking in persons and focusing more attention on this issue. When Rebecca talked about possibility of addressing this topic, we were very interested because it is such an important issue, and we're looking forward to her perspective. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Rebecca Billings.
Hello, thank you for letting me come and speak to you today. I am a graduate of BYU from many, many moons ago. It's very odd to be walking around again, but thank you for having me. I am a civil servant. I work at the State Department, and right now I work in what we call the Anti-Trafficking Office, the Trafficking in Persons Office. So if you have any burning questions while we go through this, feel free to raise your hand and we can address them then, or if you want to save them to the end, whatever works for you. Please understand, though, if there's something that's sensitive that I can't address, don't be offended when I say I can't answer it. I don't think we'll come up against too much of that stuff, but let's go ahead and watch two 1 minute each video clips that were produced by the UN Office for Drugs and Crime, the UNODC. These clips were paid for by our office to be run on television. They're in many languages. I grabbed the English ones for us, so let's take a look. There we go.
Voy a tener un buen trabajo y voy a poder mandar dinero a mi familia.
Akọ́ṣẹ́ o, mo gbọ́kànlé ọkùnrin.
Just wanted to give you an introduction to the two types of trafficking that we deal with. One is sex trafficking, and the other is labor trafficking. Let's see if we can get this going. Okay. Start with, there's a couple of quotes by former Secretary of State Colin Powell. I think the punchiest one, though, is by President Bush. No one is fit to be a master, and no one deserves to be a slave. This has been a big issue for the Bush administration. My office was actually started under the Clinton administration, and it has been something that's been important to both administrations. So we'll see what happens the next administration. But let's go ahead and... What am I talking about when I say modern-day slavery? Clearly, this is something different than the slavery that we grew up knowing about. State-sanctioned slavery, where it was absolutely legal to own, buy, sell people, their children, and treat them absolutely however their owners wanted. Seems strange to be maybe talking about slavery when this is the 200th year anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade in British Parliament. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is trafficking. No country that I know of is it legal and taxable for you to own somebody. This is preying on people who are in vulnerable positions, people who have despair, people who live in extreme poverty, people who are living in post-conflict situations who see no other way out. Sometimes they know the risks, sometimes they don't. They're exploited in a host of settings. Probably the most well-known one is to work as prostitutes or in brothels. But there's also a huge market for labor trafficking, to work in factories, fishing, mining, anything that is, manual labor. Domestic servants are also that. There's a large population that's trafficked to that arena. We're talking about big money here, actually. This is more profitable than the old form of slavery because there's little or no investment in the people that they're quote-unquote buying. People, unlike drugs or cigarettes or, weapons kind of, are reusable. Once you do a line of cocaine, it's gone. Not so with a person. So this is getting into really damaging territory. Like I said, it's extremely profitable. Now you may think, okay, this is something weird that happens in bizarre countries that I've never heard of before. I'm here to tell you that's not the case. It's a global challenge. Every country on the planet has a trafficking problem. Generally speaking, though this isn't always the case, the source countries are countries that are poor or a post-conflict situation where there isn't a lot of economic opportunity. Transit countries, which we listed about 95 of those, are countries where these victims are taken through, crossing borders, going into other countries. The destination countries are usually what we call, quote-unquote, first world countries. United States, for example, is a large destination country for trafficked victims. Whereas slavery before was state-sanctioned and you could go down to an auction and buy someone, this is now something that's run by organized crime units. The big organized crime units are highly organized. They also may deal in other products, we'll call them, drugs or cigarettes or cars or whatever they move. They also use the same routes to move people. The problem with trafficking in persons is that it doesn't take a highly organized crime unit to do this. It can be smaller mom and pop shops who are also buying and selling people. So it's really hard to trace. Just to give you an idea, these are some of the routes that we know about. This isn't everything because otherwise it'd look like spaghetti and you'd have no idea what was going on. But here's an interesting one, right? Brazil, people are being trafficked to Japan. Former Soviet Union, they're going everywhere. We had a case in the office a few weeks ago of somewhere here in Asia ending up in Côte d'Ivoire, and they thought they were in France. So they can go from anywhere to anywhere, and it's kind of chaotic, but you can look and see where most of the people are heading. Okay, so the first form of trafficking, like I said, the one that's probably most widely known about is sex trafficking. People, women usually, but not always, who are forced to become prostitutes to pay off their debt. What usually happens when someone is trafficked, well, let me get to that in a minute. The United States government policy on prostitution is basically zero tolerance. We do not advocate the legalization of prostitution. We will not give money to any NGO or international organization who supports the legalization of prostitution. We follow more the Swedish model where they have decriminalized the prostitute and criminalized the John. Right now, the administration thinks that's a great idea. So how does this happen? How do people become victims of sex trafficking? We can see, like this woman, she thought she was answering an ad to become a nanny, and that's typically what will happen. To be trafficked, there needs to be some form of force, fraud, or coercion. It isn't someone saying, hey, I'm going to be a prostitute. That isn't trafficking in and of itself. So she thought she was going to be a nanny, but she was sold into a brothel in Macedonia, where she was forced to become a prostitute. Her trafficking victims almost always have their documents taken away. So say she answered the ad, the trafficker probably took away her passport, her visa, any other kind of identifying documents, and then said, it cost me $500,000 to move you from Moldova to Macedonia, and I'm going to tell you how you're going to pay it off. So they're usually kept away from other people. Usually there is a language barrier. They can't communicate with anyone else. So it becomes a very desperate situation. And it's not only women who are forced to become prostitutes, also a lot of children are forced into prostitution. Again, preying on the vulnerable. A lot of children are trying to help out their families by going to work to send money home, which is very lucrative if done legally, but not so lucrative for the person who is being trafficked because they don't see any of their money. They may get a few dollars a week, but that's never enough to pay off their debt and send money home. So this child, Maria, was going to help be a waitress at this hotel. It's actually not her real name. And now she's forced to be a prostitute. Now in Asia, the area that I mainly cover, there's a large, we'll go to the next slide. There's a large, what's the word I'm looking for, market for sex tourism. That Western men generally will fly to Southeast Asian countries, particularly Cambodia. These are pedophiles, so they're looking for small children. So the children are sometimes sold by their families because the families are they can't feed their children. This happens in Ghana a lot. There's absolutely no way to make money. The fathers and mothers can't feed their children, so they sell their children and think, well, at least they're going to have a place to sleep and, they'll be earning money. Sometimes they don't really know what's going on. This man, Gary Glitter, was convicted of abusing 2 young girls in Vietnam and has served time there. Once he finishes his sentence, I believe the United Kingdom will extradite him, and I think there are plans to retry him again. This is a brilliant thing about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000, which set up my office and a good deal of other things, is that it also established the PROTECT Act. So as a United States citizen, if you fly somewhere else on foreign soil and you abuse a child, you are still culpable for that act, and you can serve up to 30 years in prison. So far, we've had 27 indictments and 16 convictions under this act. So if you want, it's a message to be sent that there is no tolerance for this at all. Another problem that we have, particularly in Southeast Asia, is that there is a large market for virgins. So because the age of that keeps going down, these are younger and younger children who are being sold for their virginity. So these are painfully young children, 4, 5, 6. This isn't like just barely a minor. These are small children, and it's extremely disturbing. Okay. Oops, I went the wrong way. Okay, so that's sex trafficking. Now there's labor trafficking. Forcing someone to work for you in your industry. This is camel jockeying. These young boys from probably Bangladesh or somewhere else in South Asia were trafficked to the UAE to ride camels, to race these young camels. Thanks to international pressure and the willingness of these governments, this form of labor trafficking has been eradicated. Now they have little robots that ride on the camels, and these children are no longer forced to ride the camels. Okay, Africa. This girl was sold so that she could sell water. She's also probably sexually abused, and there are lots of children in Central and West Africa who are trafficked. Now, another form of labor trafficking, is the second one, Rakish. This is a huge problem throughout the world, primarily in South Asia. It actually happens in the Western Hemisphere as well. Someone will come and say, you know what, I need a job. So these shady characters will say, okay, you can work in the brick kiln, and I'm going to give you whatever materials you need to work in this brick kiln, and it'll cost you $1.3 million. Clearly overinflated. So the man or the family, whatever, agrees to this and starts working in the brick kiln, probably 17 hours a day. But they never are able to pay off their debt because they're not being paid a fair wage. So what happens is the debt then transfers to their children. So their children are still in debt bondage, and it transfers to their children, because how in the world are they going to pay off a $1.3 million loan? I know I can't. I'm sure they can't. This happens a lot in South America with they'll give the workers a machete or what's the word I'm looking for? A chainsaw or something like that to work in forestries. And of course, these people are not able to pay off their debt. Another form of labor trafficking is for child soldiers. If you saw the movie Blood Diamond, that's pretty accurate depiction of child soldiering. Unfortunately, what they'll do is a lot of times, like in the first picture in Africa, the rebel forces will come through a village and kill some of the parents and take the small children and brainwash them into becoming soldiers for their rebel movement. It also happens, this other second child is from Burma, and the Burmese army came and took them to work in the state army. A large area, also, like I mentioned, where people are trafficked is for domestic servitude, so maids, nannies, this kind of thing. This woman is named Nur Miati. She is from Indonesia, and she went to the Gulf states to work as a maid. Her first employer was fair and reasonable, and she was able to send money home to her daughter, and things were fine. Her second employer tortured and abused her, and because of the results of the torturing, she lost her fingers and her toes to gangrene. And to add insult to injury, when she was dumped off at the hospital, they said, "Good heavens, what happened to you?" And she said, "Well, this happened while I was under the employ of this particular person." And she was then punished for defaming her employer. She was sentenced to 76 lashes. So a lot of countries are not doing a good job of protecting the victims. They don't criminalize every act of trafficking. There's no recourse for someone who's been trafficked who can't get out, and we find this problematic. So who's doing this stuff? This first guy, Boyku, is a Macedonian man, and he would pay off the police. So that the police would tip him off when there was going to be a raid on one of his brothels. The police also got free sex. He was convicted. He was arrested. He served time because of the way the Macedonian law is written. It was, in the U.S. government's opinion, a very light sentence. And any time he had served before, when he was picked up, counted toward the time he needed to serve in total, which was all legal under Macedonian law. He's currently free. The second guy, this is a fake name, but this is a Nepalese man. Sometimes he'd pose as a businessman, sometimes as a Bollywood agent, sometimes as a very rich husband looking for a wife. And that's how he would ensnare people to come with him. And This is brilliant because there are former trafficking victims who were working on the Nepal-India border, and it was one of his former victims who recognized him coming across with some women, and he is now under custody. Okay, lest you think that we're vilifying men, women are also traffickers too. In fact, more and more women are becoming traffickers because people don't really trust strange men who come into their village and say, hey, have I got a deal for you? So these trafficking networks have gotten smarter. They'll usually find a woman, usually a former trafficking victim, and they'll dress her up in whatever status symbol that is for that particular culture. Say in the former Soviet Union, it would be a big car, fur, lots of jewelry, and say, hey, she would go into the village and say, I'm very successful, look what happened to me, good things happened, you want to come with me, I will make your life good, which is, of course, a lie. Okay, so this is a question I get asked a lot. Okay, so they're kind of like in these slavery conditions, why don't they leave? That's dumb. Even if they have this fake debt, why don't they leave? Let me just posit this to you. You guys are all intelligent, educated people who've probably done some amount of world travel. If you landed in Norway or Bangladesh or, hey, even Australia, would you know how to call the cops? I don't. So we've got that first problem. Just even knowing how to do it is difficult, even for savvy world travelers, let alone people who are coming from small villages who have not been outside their villages before. A lot of the victims are afraid. Because they've been coerced, they've been defrauded, they've been abused, they have a really difficult relationship with their trafficker. And perhaps many of them have seen other trafficking victims beaten or even killed in their presence. Also, a lot of victims feel like they do have to repay the debt so they can become free, even if it's an impossible debt. A lot of victims have sold everything they own, everything their family owns, to buy this ticket to Rome to be a waitress in Rome. Okay, well, they didn't end up in Rome, but they still sold everything their family had. So they want to repay the debt, because if they leave, they go back, what do they have? They have nothing. A lot of times traffickers, especially with children, will threaten the family members to say, if you ever leave, we're going to go kill your parents or your brothers or your sisters. So trafficking victims stay because they don't want that to happen to their families. Also, the sense of shame is a huge problem, especially for women who've been forced into prostitution. They cannot return to their homes because of what they've been forced to do and how the village will receive them, which many times the village will not. For trafficking victims here in the United States, there's also a language barrier a lot of times, in other countries too, but people who are trafficked to the United States, say in agricultural work, are kept from everyone else. They are not allowed to walk around, go shop at the mall, or go to the grocery store. They're kept with other victims who speak their language, and so they wouldn't necessarily know if they were to escape, who do you talk to? Especially if you don't speak. I don't know, pick a language that you don't speak. What do you do? And also, there's a fear of what will happen from the police. If you do find the police, then what? Are they going to treat you fairly? Are they going to treat you like a victim? In many countries, no. This is a problem. So, especially if they've experienced bad policing in their home country, why should they trust the cops in this new country? And let's not forget that a lot of victims sometimes are trafficked internally within the borders of their own country. So we'd have a hard time measuring that. But the ones who do cross the border, who knows how the cops will treat them. Okay, so what is the State Department's role in dealing with this issue? When the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2007, it established a congressionally mandated report. It's required by law. This is the 2006 report. So people in my office spend all year writing this thing. I'll talk more about that later. We also engage in public diplomacy, events like this, just to raise awareness all over the world. Then what I do is the third bullet down, which is Okay, so countries are having a hard time. They don't understand legislation, maybe exactly how it will fit into their constitution, or how to criminalize everything, or how to put all the pieces together, or maybe they need help with shelters for victims, or help on coordinating work between the government and NGOs. That's what my office does, or my section of this office. I'm a programs officer, so I give money away. I'm very popular. So if we see that a country, maybe pick a country, Indonesia or whatever, the embassy would like to do this particular project, I'm the person that awards the grant for that. And then we're also the chair for the President's Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking. So the whole United States government works together on developing a strategy on what we're going to do in the coming year to address the problem. So just to give you a general idea, there's a lot of money being put into this effort. Domestic spending, this item down here, this is mainly Department of Justice stuff, FBI. The rest of this stuff is USAID, Agency for International Development, State Department, Department of Labor are the main contributors to that. Yes? Absolutely. Yes. As much money, I'm not sure about the funding levels, but the UN is very interested in this. The International Organization on Migration is a big player in this. The UN Office of Drugs and Crime, the International Labor Organization. There are lots of international organizations and NGOs who are working on this. So it's certainly not a USG policy only, but it definitely, I think the USG was spearheading this. We're the only government on the planet who produces this document, which I know many people use. I had meetings with some guys at the EU, Europol, and they say they look forward to seeing it every year. Okay, well, I just answered my own question. These are the people who are involved in anti-trafficking initiatives. And as far as even breaking down state, this is my office, the GTIP office. Population, Refugees, and Migration also contributes. This is my old bureau, Drugs and Thugs. Also pay primarily for, we do a lot of they do a lot of things, but mainly prosecutorial training, legislative amendments, that kind of stuff. And actually the Bureau for Educational and Cultural Affairs gets involved too. There are a lot of international visitors exchange programs that they put on, which are extremely, extremely beneficial. Okay, so let's talk about this. This is the big biggie. So this report is kind of a name and shame. Who's addressing the problem? Who isn't? Now, trickily enough, the United States does not rank itself. It ranks a lot of other countries, though. So what are we looking at? What is the United States government looking at in talking about these other countries? Well, we want to talk about the 3P approach. We want to know how countries are doing preventing this from happening in the first place. As the United States, how are we doing at preventing people from being trafficked? Did you know about trafficking before this lecture? Okay, I didn't know it existed before I started working at state. Are we training the police? Are we, whoever is going to be the first responder, are they trained? Do they know what they're doing? We'd also like to really discourage demand for this. I know a lot of companies, US-based companies, are looking at their supply chain to see if there's any trafficking victims involved in their supply chains. And I think it's very commendable that these companies are trying to make sure that they're not buying anything from quote unquote slave labor. Okay, the second P is protection. We want to see how countries are doing to identify these victims and treat them appropriately. If you find a prostitute working the street, is she a prostitute or is she a trafficking victim? How does a policeman know, or a police officer know? How can we get the NGOs and the governments to work together better so that when we do find a victim, he or she is treated appropriately? Okay, and the third P is prosecution. We want the traffickers to be prosecuted. We want it to be fair. We don't want it to be, a slap on the hands. This is a serious crime. We'd also like countries to pass anti-trafficking legislation and prosecute the traffickers under that legislation. So we rank countries, Tier 1 being the highest ranking, Tier 3 being the lowest ranking. Okay, so what does this all mean? Tier 1 is countries whose governments fully comply with the minimum standards of those Ps. You know, do they criminalize every act of trafficking? Or is there adequate protection for victims? These kinds of things. It does not mean that there is not a trafficking problem in said country. It just means that this government is fully engaged in working to make sure that the problem is addressed. And a little side note, you'll notice this is from Ecuador. Trata in Spanish is trafficking in persons. Tráfico means trafficking of drugs, generally. So that's the first thing we had to figure out when speaking with countries who speak Spanish was we're not talking about tráfico. That's someone else's thing. We're interested in trata. Okay, Tier 2 are countries who do not fully comply with the minimum standards of the Act, but are making significant strides to do so. This young boy is making zaris, probably in India. Okay, Tier 2 watch list. That's a lot of words on there. Basically, there is a severe problem in that country, and they're not really doing enough to be on Tier 2, but they're not bad enough to be on Tier 3, is basically what all those words say. Okay, and Tier 3 is countries whose governments do not fully comply with the minimum standards and are not making significant efforts to do so. This is a picture from a brothel in India. So if you want more information, here are some fabulous websites that you can check out. I might especially recommend my office's. The TIP is Trafficking in Persons. I got through that really fast. Do you have any questions that you want to ask?
If you do, just wait for Jana to bring you the mic. So, thank you.
Hi. You briefly mentioned the Swedish model and how the U.S. thinks that that's a good model to follow, which involves prosecuting the Johns and the pimps and decriminalizing the prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if the U.S. has actually enacted legislation for that.
No, they have not.
Okay, that's what I thought.
No, it is still a crime in the United States to be a prostitute.
Okay, and I was wondering if there's any plans to push for legislation decriminalizing the prostitute, and also if there's any sort of, like when victims of trafficking are found, if there are any programs in the United States that allow them to be repatriated into their countries or any sort of, rehabilitation programs.
That's a good question. I don't know of any plans to decriminalize prostitution. My guess is probably not. But the United States has been leading the effort to assist victims. We have what's called a T visa. So if a trafficking victim is found and verified, that person can stay in the United States legally, and sometimes even minor dependents can come to the United States to be with that parent, and then they can decide if they want to stay in the United States or if they want to go back to their former country. But it is an integrated effort with the Immigration and Customs enforcement guys, the ICE guys, Department of Justice, state. Everyone's involved in trying to assist victims, especially with shelters and stuff like that.
There are a lot of smaller NGOs that are also working on this.
Mm-hmm.
How much does the State Department work with those smaller organizations, like within the U.S., to try and stop efforts abroad? Because some of them actually go and perform, sting operations or have specifically allocated funds for victim relief. What does the U.S. State Department do in relation to those organizations?
Well, state doesn't actually deal with any NGOs that are working inside the United States. That's more of a Department of Justice turf thing. But how do you like that thing? Yeah, good technical word. The State Department's mandate is to work overseas. So we are very involved with small NGOs, big NGOs, who are working with victims to either provide immediate assistance to rescue them from their enslavement. Some really great NGOs. There's a particularly great one. It's a Swiss Christian-based one called Hagar that I work with in Cambodia, and they have the holistic approach to treating victims. They deal with the immediate medical issues, psychological issues. Then they try to teach the victims gainful employment skills, soy milk factory or handwork or a catering business, to give them a skill they can market themselves and be profitable and earn money for their families. So the State Department is very involved in funding small NGOs overseas.
What's the best thing that we could do here as students and just in the U.S.? Like, I want to just go and shoot all these bad guys, but what could we do?
Not getting yourself arrested would be good. Keep your eyes open. If you see a situation that looks fishy, it probably is. If there's a maid who only comes to the door supervised, or if she's never out of the presence of the family, if she doesn't have documents, or I should say there are a lot of male trafficking victims too. I should have brought some information that there are hotlines. The Department of Justice has set up hotlines that you can call, and there are NGOs in many big cities that will link up the government side with the NGO side and the service side to help get them out. So I would say just try to be aware. If someone looks like they're not having a good time, they probably aren't. If they're not at the mall or grocery shopping or the library or whatever, that's probably a victim. Is that helpful?
Should we write letters to senators or congressmen? Who makes decisions? Because I think we're making good efforts, but I don't know, it just seems like the U.S. could maybe do more. But I don't know what we could do except for keep pushing other countries to change.
That has been, and that's something I want to say. Let me springboard off that. This is a terrible, horrible thing that is happening to, a million or two people a year. But something that's really good about this office is in the 7 years that it's been in existence. Let me see if I wrote down any stats. Things have changed. From 2000 to 2007, well over 104 countries have passed legislation that criminalizes trafficking, who also amended their legislation to include trafficking as an issue. Convictions have steadily increased in the 7 years, so I think you're right. This has been a useful tool. As far as trafficking in the United States, I think there are a lot of senators who are behind it, and I don't know, besides getting involved with NGOs and just raising awareness, I think that could be a very useful thing. I know there are a lot of runaway teens in the States who are also trafficked. That's my advice to you. I hope that's helpful.
Two questions. Is there any sense in your understanding that those numbers you just gave us are tip of the iceberg?
That's the difficulty in dealing with this issue. It's not like it's so hidden. No one's going to come out and say, hey, guess what, I'm a trafficking victim, because they don't know what's going to happen to them, and traffickers don't wear badges that say, I sell people. It's really, really hard to get a good grasp on what exactly is going on, especially with internal trafficking, because you can't catch them as they cross an international border, because they're not. So, yeah, that's a problem that we're not really sure. We're guessing 800,000 to 1 million, but that could be way off. It's hard to get a measure of that.
So along with that, border control is a big issue in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing other countries, because of this, instigated by this concern, looking harder at border control there as well?
Some countries, yes. And some countries are very good. They'll have specific people who are set up to watch to see if someone comes through with a gaggle of children that don't look anything like each other. They're training their border officials to look and see, and maybe pull everyone apart and interview them separately. If they all have the same story, then okay, and if not, some fishy's going on. There are a lot of, I think in the Philippines there are a lot, it's an island nation. A lot of people at the ferry terminals are also being trained on how to ask questions that are leading to arrests and convictions and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's one element that's very helpful. And I mentioned the India-Nepal border. That's brilliant, the way that they've decided to address that, because it's a very open border.
What role does the Department of Defense play in this issue, if any?
DOD, they have zero tolerance policy on visiting prostitutes, and as I understand it, let me check my notes. As I understand it, they are required, anyone who is in the military is required to attend a John school that will educate the men on how them visiting a prostitute could adversely affect the prostitute or themselves, especially with the link with HIV/AIDS. So let me just make for sure. Yeah, here, let me read this. The Department of Defense has implemented a zero-tolerance stand and made patronizing a prostitute a specific chargeable offense in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. DoD has also instituted a service-wide mandatory anti-tip training program for all military personnel.
Can you tell us any of the Tier 3 countries and if there are any sanctions or what efforts are being made to influence them to meet the standards that you talked about?
Good question, yes. This report, as far as I'm aware, is the only congressionally mandated report that carries the threat of sanctions. So if you end up on Tier 3, you could receive sanctions from the United States government. This is at the liberty of Secretary Rice. Let me see. They're currently working on the 2007 report. Tier 3, last year, 2006, Belize, Burma, Cuba, Iran, Laos, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Syria, Uzbekistan, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. So yeah, we would very much like to see them get off the Tier 3 list. Some of these countries are making efforts. Some, as you can imagine, don't really care, which is really infuriating.
I know, over here,
Go
I know
ahead.
Europe had some success in the mid-90s cracking down on human trafficking, mostly because there was so much pressure from each individual country on the other one to do something about it. But Russia was kind of left in the wake. And Russia's got an internal problem with trafficking that no one seems to be able to influence them to crack down on it. And I noticed they're not on the Tier 3. Are they on the Tier 2? Because I know in the 2004 report, I thought they were on the on the second tier. But what influence does America have on Putin to try and do something within their national borders? Because so far it's been...
You're right, it's a huge problem. They're Tier 2 watch list, so that means they're teetering on falling into Tier 3. Russia's hard. Russia's very hard because it seems like they have become more and more isolated themselves, which is unfortunate because the Central Asian countries are drawn heavily to Russia. So not only do you're right, they have an internal problem, they also are having people from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan going up into Russia. So this is one tool we have to push Putin and his government. Our office has visited Russia a lot this year, trying to at least let them work with NGOs, I think is the great way to start. But it's hard to push someone who doesn't want to be pushed. So, good question. I don't have a good answer, unfortunately.
One more question.
How does the State Department address entities like supranational organizations such as the EU? I was thinking of World Cup last year, which was in Germany,
Right.
and Germany brought in a whole bunch of prostitutes to service those who were attending the World Cup. That would probably be, I'm guessing, an internal problem because of the fluid borders in the EU. But it seems to me that the growth of supranational organizations complicates this problem in ways that maybe the State Department hasn't dealt with in the past.
Actually, the way we deal with the EU is we deal with them country by country and bilaterally. Europol does exist, and we do communicate with them because they have an interest in addressing the trafficking problems they have within EU member states. Actually, I really have to give snaps to the Germans. They went out of their way to make sure that these alleged prostitutes, there weren't the rumored sex huts, and after the fact, we haven't been able to find any evidence that really happened. But we saw all the prevention materials that went out. some were quite humorous, actually, addressing the problem, saying, you know, it is illegal in Germany to visit a trafficking victim. And I think prostitution is still illegal in Germany. Now, where we get kind of sketchy as the United States government is dealing with countries like the Netherlands, where it is legal, and we've found that despite its being legal and because of its being legal, there's a large draw for the trafficking industry to grow up on the outsides, because as I understand it, it is only legal for a Dutch citizen to be a prostitute in the Netherlands. But we're finding women and men from other countries who are also working as prostitutes, and that is not legal, and they have been trafficked. So does that answer your question?
I'm just wondering if the State Department has any relationship with the European Union as a whole. It seems to me that that's a different strategy for addressing what is becoming in terms of the European Union and their reach within their member states.
Right. We do, as a State Department, have a relationship with the European Commission. The problem that we have is we can't just say trafficking is bad, you need to deal with it, because there isn't a European constitution that legalizes or criminalizes the same things at different places. So our recourse then is to deal with each country individually and their law individually until there is or is not an EU constitution.